In Eastern Europe, many seemingly insignificant post-Soviet states have popped up in the past few decades, but believe it or not, one of these small groups nearly dominated the eastern half of Europe for several centuries in the not-so-distant past, and were also one of the lesser-known powers to colonize the Americas, yet they're a group that very few outsiders discuss or care for outside of sensationalist news, being virtually non-existent from most American curriculum. I am, of course, mentioning the Baltic region and people, a category that includes Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, and even though Estonians do not belong to the same ethno-linguistic group, this loose regional affiliation still has far more in common than most people groups in Europe, and quite the interesting history. Although the Baltic nations may not seem too impressive today, having a combined population less than the state of Indiana and falling quickly, they still hold influence over many of the surrounding countries and beyond due to their legacy as one of Europe's strongest empires to ever exist. The Baltic peoples are, of course, named after the Baltic Sea, although it gets a bit more complicated, explained later, and currently includes the three-ish ethnic groups of the Estonians in the north, a Finno-Ugric group related to the Finns, Sami, and the Hungarians very distantly, the Latvians in the middle, and Lithuanians in the south, with the latter two of these actually belonging to the Baltic proper language family, being the last two surviving members of this group. The Baltic language family was previously classified as a branch of Slavic, separate from the northern varieties, but in more recent years, the Baltic family has been recognized as being distinct from the surrounding Slavic languages such as Polish, Russian, and Belarusian, although the two most likely have a common origin in the greater Indo-European language family, although Baltic groups, or Balts, like the Latvians and Lithuanians, do not consider themselves to be Slavs, even though I myself am guilty of simplifying this in the past. In reality, although these two languages are not mutually intelligible, they are still quite easily distinguished from all other European languages, and their history and genetics are deeply tied to that of Germany, Scandinavia, the Finns, and of course the Slavs. Being one of the most ancient groups in Europe, the Uralic tribes of northern Eurasia were some of the first people to have inhabited the Baltic region, meaning they were of the same lineage as the Finns, Estonians, Karelians, and others in the Ural mountain range and Siberia, and this can be seen by the heavy impact in the Baltic languages, culture, and genetic, as the haplogroup distribution among Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians is nearly identical, being dominated by haplogroup N, originating in Siberia, and R1A, which is associated with early Indo-European migrants, especially Slavs and other Eastern Europeans. However, outside of this region, genetically speaking, the closest people to the modern Baltic ethnicities would have to be Russians from the northwest region of the country, as ethnic Russians from this region have heavy admixture from the native people, including Uralic and Baltic tribes, who were largely assimilated during the Russian expansion. By the time of the first millennia AD, there existed a multitude of distinct tribes in the Baltic region, including the Estonians and aforementioned eponymous Balts, with the latter being divided between the Eastern and Western Balts, perhaps with one of the most famous Western Baltic groups being the Prussians, and being one of the last pockets of Europe yet to be Christianized, the Baltic people saw themselves in an ever-decreasing world of the old European pagans. Although many Balts were initially fiercely resistant to the encroachment of their land by Germanic and Scandinavian Christians, by the 12th century, the Catholic Church, wishing to purge Europe of all paganistic influences, launched a religious campaign against the Baltic pagans and other pagans of northern Europe, with invasions coming from the Holy Roman Empire, known as the Teutonic Knights or Order, as well as Scandinavia. Baltic pagan groups like the Prussians or Latvians were conquered and forcibly assimilated into the Holy Roman Empire, while the other Baltic nations such as Estonia and Latvia became vassals of Sweden and Denmark. Hence these nations were Lutheran, much like in Scandinavia and parts of Germany, while the Lithuanians became Catholic due to the German influence, as thousands of Germanic and Scandinavian settlers began to settle in this region, especially the former Baltic Prussia. In fact, the old Prussian nation became so heavily saturated by German immigration and influence that they disappeared altogether in a matter of centuries, with the last Prussian speaker dying in the early 1700s, with the entirety of the Prussians and other Western Baltic peoples being assimilated into the new Germanic population. But hey, the Germans did co-opt the name of Prussian as their own. But interestingly, the name Baltic or Baltan is actually Germanic in origin, as the original German settlers of this region used the term strictly to refer to themselves, while the native tribes were referred to as Latvies or Litvies. But due to intermarriage and assimilation, the Prussian Germans, especially those in the east, were very heavily influenced by the Slavic and native Baltic nations in both culture and genetics, although they still established themselves as the upper class in much of this region. In addition to the three Baltic nations mentioned earlier, there was also formerly a Finno-Ugric group known as the Livonians, who formerly inhabited what is now western Latvia. However, following centuries of assimilation, the Livonian people have nearly gone extinct, with no native speakers and only a few hundred identifying as ethnic Livonians today. But the entire Baltic peoples would not disappear into the night, as also during this time, Lithuania, the southernmost surviving Baltic nation, was rising against both the Germans to the west and the Slavs in the east, with Lithuanians expanding into the neighboring Principality of Rus, although it wasn't until the 14th century that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania officially adopted Catholicism as the state religion, making it the last paganistic European power in history. Lithuania absorbed many territories that lie in modern-day Belarus and Ukraine and established itself as a major regional power in Europe, but following the merger of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, their influence had expanded even further, although of course during this time ethnic Lithuanians were clearly a small minority in their own multi-ethnic monarchy, also having large minorities of Germans, Eastern Slavs, Lithuanian or Lipka Tatars who arrived from the Urals, and of course Ashkenazi Jews, with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at one point holding the majority of Jews on Earth, being the center of the Jewish community worldwide. There were also other Baltic powers loosely associated with the Polish-Lithuanian Union, such as the Duchy of Courland and Semigalia, a Lithuanian vassal established by German migrants, and Courland was also one of the only non-Western European powers to ever colonize the Americas, other than the Russians and Alaska, of course, with the Coronian colony in the Caribbean island of Tobago being briefly involved in a trade war in the region. But the Polish-Lithuanian superpower was still constantly warring with and against neighboring powers such as the French, Germans, Russians, and Swedes, almost completely collapsing to the latter of these on a multitude of occasions, and the Lithuanians and Poles lost much of their territory to Prussia, Russia, and Austria in the 18th century following invasions by these foreign groups. Although surrounded on all sides by mostly hostile nations, the Poles, Lithuanians, and other Balts wished to remain an independent power of these gargantuan states, but of course we all know how that turned out, as a series of further partitions wiped the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth off the map entirely, with the bulk of this former Grand Empire being given to the Russians, including the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. For a couple of centuries afterwards, the Baltic states were an integral part of the Russian Empire, and although never quite returning to their former glory, they were still highly sought after by both Russia, Germany, Poland, and Sweden for their ideal geographical placement, being at the crossroads for many important ports for trade and exploration. Many Balts, but especially Lithuanians, would travel outside of the Russian Empire, even as far as Canada, Argentina, but especially Brazil and the United States, both of which have some of the largest Lithuanian diasporas in the world. The Baltic states would briefly gain independence following the collapse of the Russian Empire during World War I, although during World War II the Baltic states were once again invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, which utterly decimated the population, and the Balts had, and still do, have very mixed feelings on the Soviet liberation of their territory, as the states were forcibly reincorporated into the USSR, and the previously numerous Baltic German and Swedish communities were deported almost in their entirety, including the German city of Königsberg, neighboring Lithuania, which of course became the Russian Oblast of Kaliningrad. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states have suffered from some of the most pronounced cases of population decline in the world, losing over a fourth of their population in only a matter of decades, and this has been caused by demographic factors such as low birth rates, high suicide and death rates, but also an increased vigor for migration towards Western Europe, especially the United Kingdom in recent years. The population of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, about 1, 2, and 3 million people respectively, is actually about the same as it was in the 1930s before World War II, as clearly being in the center of the largest armed conflict in history cost the Balts a huge toll, suffering some of the highest per capita deaths for any country outside of the USSR or Poland. As a sort of quick fix for the extreme decrease in manpower, large numbers of citizens from the rest of the Soviet Union were encouraged to settle in this region, and because of this, there are still very large Slavic minorities in every Baltic nation, and although Latvia and Lithuania have still retained their Christian culture for the most part, Estonia today is one of the most irreligious countries in the world, as well as being one of the most tech-savvy, internet-connected ones. And interestingly, a large neo-pagan movement has appeared in the Baltic states, as in other parts of Europe, harkening back to their pre-Crusader days, although the whole European neo-paganist revival is honestly a topic for another day. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone that I've actually created a survey designed to gauge some of the demographic traits of my audience. So if you haven't participated in the Mason Man channel census of 2018, this next week will be the last few days to do it before I post my analysis video, which I am beyond ecstatic to do. So, link in the description, be sure to check it out. It takes about 6 minutes and you can view the results when you've finished. So, in conclusion, although the Lithuanians and other Balts were arguably the kings of Eastern Europe at one point, and they may not seem too terribly significant in today's global landscape, they still have connections with many regions of Europe and throughout the world. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. And for today's poll, let me know which Baltic nation is of the most interest to you personally. And as always, thanks so much for watching.